Hey everyone, this is our lecture on the Fu organs. They're a lot simpler to understand than the Zog organs. There's really less to them, so not quite as long of a subject, but still an important one that we talk about. And in each of them, there's some interesting details that you get to kind of learn as you go through them. So, anyways, that's what we're up to. I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna screen share this out so we can kind of look at our notes at the same time, and we will talk about starting with the stomach. All right, so stomach is Wei. There's a really famous book called The Treatise on the Spleen in the Stomach called the Pi Wei Lun. But as we talked about, different times during the semester, in general, these pinyin terms aren't really used, so I don't really hold people responsible for learning them. But nice to see them as far as it goes in the notes. The stomach is longer, and it's longer in a really kind of weird and maybe slightly annoying way, in that it really talks about every single thing that a GI tract organ does, and it kind of breaks it apart. And then in general, this isn't done over and over again when you get to the small intestine and the large intestine. This just sort of showed here when you're talking about the stomach, and then they kind of drop going into all the detail, and though it's still sort of assumed. So, anyways, it gets to be longer really because it describes all these little different steps. You'll see what I mean as we go through. So the first thing that's mentioned here is that the stomach controls receiving. The idea is that each GI tract organ, and now we're talking about the stomach, receives from the parts of the GI tract above it. There's also something, of course, special about the stomach because that's how food gets into the GI tract overall. So the esophagus is the upper branch of the stomach. If you need to treat the stomach, go treat it through the esophagus. Food goes into the stomach. Okay, step one, that's the receiving. Then you get this weird language of controls the rotting and ripening of food. I really hate these kinds of translations. They sound very medieval to me, and I don't like it. But you do get translators doing this. I think this, Masiosa does something like this in his textbook too. I don't think it sounds great. You'd obviously never ask a patient how they feel about the rotting and ripening of their food. I don't know. Anyways, what's really being talked about here is transformation. So really, it's the transformation function and the transportation function that are being mentioned in these organs all the time. Now, we know that the chi of the spleen is coming in to empower this, and now we have this transforming happening in the stomach, and that's what they mean by rotting and ripening. So I have the word transformation there, and that pretty much covers that step. So we've done receiving, we've done the transforming part. Then we get this idea of transportation of food essences. So really what's being talked about on the level of the stomach here is absorption, that the GI tract organs sort of absorb the nutritional content, the Gucci, and that's their job. Underneath this, I say transportation upward. That could read kind of funny with the way I worded it. So let me make sure I make this clear. The stomach's job isn't to lift these things upward. We already learned that it has to do with the spleen chi. Spleen chi is responsible for the raising function upwards, and this gets carried up to the upper jiao, right, to become part of that whole story of Da Qi, Gu Qi, and Yuan Qi that we covered when we looked at how the body builds new qi and blood. So, anyways, that transportation upward, I'm just alluding to the fact that the spleen chi does the lifting upwards once this has been absorbed. But the job of the stomach is to do the absorbing. Then you get to the last piece, controls the descending of chi. This is going to happen again in every GI tract organ. If they're doing what they're supposed to do, they're going down, right? So the stomach is going to push the contents down. Those things that haven't been able to be processed on the level of the stomach will be processed on the level of the small intestine. We've definitely talked through that a lot. And then, the rest of this will continue throughout the GI tract. The stomach gets mentioned here specifically because it's the place where they talk about all these functions. But there's one other trick to this kind of, which is the same way the stomach is responsible for the intake of food. And if you can't take things in, if you can't do receiving, well, then you're really kind of out of luck. You're screwed. So there's a special role in terms of receiving. And then sometimes you get the idea that there's a special role in the stomach in terms of descending. The idea being that the stomach, if it's doing its job right, it starts descending things correctly. And then this is able to be repeated throughout the rest of the GI tract. It sort of has a ripple effect and a positive effect in terms of descending chi throughout the whole GI tract. So I say through the GI tract, just meaning that it has that kind of rippling influence. This means there's something important about the stomach in terms of acupuncture point categories and theory. As it says here, Ren 12 is the front move point of the stomach. It's the main point you use to affect the stomach. acupuncture theory, we have all these mu points that you can treat the different organs through the front of the body. But it's also considered to be the influential point of the Fu when you get to thinking about this idea of influential points. And part of the way that's read then is that the stomach has this special influential effect on the rest of the GI tract overall and probably the Fu organs overall. But as far as this function goes, it's important because it starts this downward descending activity through the GI tract, right at the start. Okay, so that's kind of this broken apart thing. And when you look at it, it's really describing like four things that's broken up into all these separate functions. It doesn't take a lot to realize, well, every Fu organ in the GI tract does something like that. And that's true. It's just that they bother to sort of break it apart here. So it looks kind of really artificially wordy. But the first part is receiving, they're all going to receive from the part of the GI tract above them. You get this idea of the transformation happening, absorption is happening, and then finally this idea of descending down through the GI tract. Stomach has maybe some special things in theory around this, but all the GI tract organs do this. Oh, excuse me. It's all about the professionalism. All right. So the next thing is origin of fluids. So this is the fluid model that we talked about. And the good fluids in the Chinese fluid model are absorbed on the level of the stomach. The small intestine and the large intestine push fluids more into the water phase to get eliminated. The stomach is the part where the fluids get absorbed, the healthy fluid or the healthy ingredients for the fluids, you might say, and then those get filtered into that sort of circulation of fluid model that we talked about with the clouds raining down and all that kind of microcosm, macrocosm kind of stuff that we already dealt with. So, anyways, it has a special role in terms of being the main organ where the healthy ingredients of the fluids are absorbed. I didn't do this with the Zong organs, but I did it with the Fu organs because I think it's helpful to get some feeling for them. A lot of the stuff in the textbooks is on the Fu organs is a little brief or something, so it's kind of nice to get a little bit more. The stomach isn't brief. Stomach's a little long. But anyways, it's nice to get a little contribution from the Yellow Emperor here. So what's said is that the spleen and stomach are responsible for the storehouses and granaries, the idea that they're the main organs. They're going to be involved in digestion, kind of as an earthy pair, right? Internal, external pair. And then storehouses and granaries means they're helping the body transform and absorb nutrition. And it says the five tastes stem from them, meaning healthy appetite and healthy enjoyment of food. Sometimes people have a complaint like, okay, I'll eat, but the food doesn't really seem to have any flavor. So this is the idea that the earth phase is responsible for these fundamental things. There's another like interesting tidbit about this. When you get to old books like The Yellow Emperor, they're written very briefly. In some ways, these old books were kind of difficult. You have to have people who were copyists or people who were somehow reproducing them. So a lot of things are written very sparse. And so there's a certain like deeper meaning in these old Su Wen things, and that the little details kind of matter. And so this is the only yin yang pair where the yin yang pair are mentioned together in like one little section, one little statement. So it, excuse me, my voice is being funny. So, the spleen and the stomach are talked about kind of together in this very like special way, which really says that there's a very intimate relationship between them, maybe even more so than some of the other organs that are other organs we would think of as being connected, like the liver and the gallbladder or the kidney and the bladder. So anyway, so that's the idea there. It's something special is being said about this pair. Later on, when the great Li Dong Yuan, like 1300s person, 1200, 1300 person writes his book, he calls it The Treatise on the Spleen and the Stomach, kind of almost acknowledging the specialness of this pair, which goes all the way back to the Yellow Emperor. Some little details at the end for each of these. There's this notion of the three Wan points. If you go and you check out the names of these 3 points, however you do it in the Denman book or however you're studying for your point classes, you notice that each of these has a word Wan in it, W-A-N, in the pinyin. And Ren 12 is the middle one, Ren 13 is the upper one, Ren 10 is the lower one. Wan is a weird word to translate. I think Deadman does it as venter. That's another one of these words where you just kind of shrug because that doesn't mean much in English. But the real reason to bring this up is that one of the big interpretations of this is that this does indicate that there's three parts to the stomach in TCM theory. And it's kind of interesting for me. This came up a little bit earlier in the semester when we were talking about the controlling cycle, whether or not people remember that or not, I don't know. But we talked about like some of these things are a little bit said clearer in some of the Tibetan texts. Tibetan Buddhist medicine is really interesting in that it has features that it gets from Indian sources and it has things that it gets medically from Chinese sources. I think some of the medical stuff is even a little bit uh, deeper from the Chinese sources. Yeah, I think a lot of the meditative stuff and those kinds of things, probably more emphasis on India, but the medical things, a big emphasis on China. And I remember reading one of the Tibetan medical texts, and they were like, "Yeah, the stomach has three parts in Asian medicine." It's not usually said in the textbooks, to be honest. But the point is that when you look at how it's being discussed in acupuncture theory, and I'm kind of circling these 3 points, that's where you really get the idea of the three parts of the stomach. And that matches Western medicine. One part's going to receive, one part is going to do the majority of the transformation. That's the Ren 12 part. Ren 13 is receiving. And then Ren 10 is where the stomach pivots down and starts moving things into the small intestine. So, kind of an interesting thing to look at. There are some acupuncture prescriptions by some great acupuncturists. Jeffrey Yuen, Master Yuen, is sort of a modern key opinion leader, you might say, in the United States, uses these 3 points together to treat the three parts of the stomach. And then there's a great TCM 20th century acupuncturist from China named Wang Leiting, and he uses them. So it's sort of an acknowledgement in these prescriptions that there's these three parts of the stomach and to be treated this way. So that's kind of cool to know. All right, a little bit of comparison of how the internal and external pairs interact with one another. This will be a repeating thing we'll look at when we look at each of the Fu organs. But the idea is for the stomach and the spleen, they're very entwined together. And the spleen is obviously the yin organ, and the stomach is the yang organ. There are whole essays written about their interactions with each other. And I remember reading one back as I was graduating from grad school, and these essays were starting to get interesting to me. I had a certain amount of theory and knowledge under my belt by that point. You get good by the end of grad school and you're interested in like deeper sources. And there was a whole essay where they were really talking about the stomach and the spleen and how they have this sort of yin yang interesting relationship with one another. The stomach is a yang organ, but it descends downward. So it's one of those yang organs that is moving from the heaven to the earth, you might say, or moving from the yang and pushing downwards. Its vulnerabilities are terms of heat and dryness. This is going to be one of the ideas you're going to learn when you think of the stomach as part of this thing called yang ming, which is vulnerable to heat. And so that's the weak spot of the stomach theoretically is like this. For American patients, it's hard to say with the dryness because our diets are so heavy. And, we're in the Chicagoland area. It's pretty damp, relatively speaking. So I don't know if we perfectly show this dryness, but the heat thing is kind of there. And then it's the yang organ. Okay. The spleen is a yin organ. Got it. But kind of paradoxically enough, its nature is to raise upwards, raising up the Gucci upwards and just kind of creating the raising function overall. So that seems interesting in terms of their yin and yangness. They have these opposite directions. And then the spleen is also vulnerable to damp and cold. The main pathology you'll get with the spleen as you go forward will be that its qi or its yang gets weak. And then you get buildup of things like pathological fluids, damp, as we talked about, and then even cold. So, anyways, it's kind of good to look at the relationships between these two organs, yin and yang, internal pairs, and then there's something kind of special about the spleen and the stomach. Small intestine. Okay, the idea of the small intestine is that it controls receiving and transforming. Um, we'll look at the Yellow Emperor quote in a little bit, and it's going to be in the classics, one of the main organs involved in where the transformation happens. Now, there's a weird thing in the TCM that you all are going to be studying, once we get out of this semester, which is that for whatever reason, TCM doesn't like to talk about the small intestine. And it's very strange because it's 19 feet long. 20 feet long? I don't know. It depends on the person, right? But it's long and it's kind of important. And you'll notice after this semester goes by, you'll go entire classes and you're like, they never talked about this organ even once, even though it's this major thing. And that always seemed really strange to me. And I remember thinking, well, maybe in the classics, they just didn't recognize the small intestine. As I went to go look at the classics, it turned out that wasn't true. They did recognize that the small intestine was really important. So for some reason, when the TCML was put together in the 1950s, the thing that's the basis of our curriculum, you know, in the United States and pretty much all over the world, Chinese culture, medical culture exported, this version of TCM, right? We talked about that whole question. So, when they did that, when they put this together in the 50s, for some reason they decided not to talk that much about the small intestine. My own theory about this, you can ask me at some point if you want to like get some thoughts on that, if it strikes your fancy to want to know more about that. But this will be the case. So, and it's not because of the classics, it's just because of some decision that was made in the 1950s. Anyways, that's the context for this stuff. On the other hand, you could still see some of that being talked about here as still being important. So it says it controls receiving and transforming. Okay, that harkens back to what we were talking about with the stomach. You still have to receive, you have to transform, you have to absorb, you have to descend. Okay, but it's also saying, okay, it receives. How does it receive? It receives from the stomach. And then emphasizing the transforming part, we're going to see this when we talk about the yellow emperor. Have a little sip here. Voice is being a little funny. But if we skip ahead, what we can see is from the yellow emperor, the small intestine is responsible for receiving and making things thrive. That's kind of stronger language, making things thrive, meaning that it's the main organ that's going to help provide the Gucci that's going to empower the substances, because it says transformed substances stem from it. So the language in the classics, the Yellow Emperor, is pretty strong. Energy comes in from the spleen, and then we'll look at how the small intestine might get some other support as well. And then the idea is it's the main place where most of the Gucci is going to be absorbed, and then the transformed substances, the five substances, will stem from it. So I know kind of a funny thing. Again, that reads still kind of strong in our kind of TCM textbook language. We know we're receiving from the stomach. We're transforming the ingredients that are going to make up the five substances, like it says in the Yellow Emperor. And yet, again, you'll go many semesters and you won't talk about the small intestine almost at all. I'll give away the main pattern that's talked about in a second or two, but it's a subject matter that I don't know. It's weird. The whole thing is kind of odd. All right, to be continued. Separates fluids. All right. So what we saw with the small intestine when we looked at the model for the production of qi in blood was that the small intestine is the main place where the pathological fluids are kind of separated out. And the idea is that these fluids then go into the water phase and then are eliminated, uh, you know, via the water phase from the kidney into the bladder. Like we talked about before, the small intestine and the bladder are both Tai Yang. So sometimes they'll just say it goes from the small intestine into the bladder directly, a Tai Yang to Tai Yang kind of hookup. But the implied is the idea that it's going through the kidney. So I think that bothered me as a student. Are they saying this goes straight into the bladder? They're really not saying that. It's just they're mentioning those two organs together because they have this special relationship in Taiyang. Okay, the other thing I have here, and I'll unscreen share this for in a second, is this idea of the spleen, the kidney yang, and the heart fire. What am I getting at there? And the idea is, I'm gonna whiteboard this out really quick for us. Got a nice red marker for the fire face here. The idea is that the small intestine has a lot of work to do. On the one hand, it has to shoot out all of this Gucci. On the other hand, it has to direct all these waste fluids out, and then it's going to send on the turbid into the large intestine. So part of the story is going to look a little bit like this. Hard to focus this perfectly, but small intestine on the one hand, a lot of Gucci. Hard to focus with this particular camera. A lot of Gucci, a lot of the turbid over here going into the large intestine, and then this idea of the waste fluids going out. So that's a lot of work, right? And The idea then is that the small intestine, when you look at it from the classical theory, again, this is not going to be mentioned much in these TCM textbooks because the small intestine is so downplayed for whatever or various reasons. But I'd just like to point out that the small intestine actually gets its resources through a number of different sources. And again, this camera's kind of crap in looking at this whiteboard. But the idea would be it has these two big jobs, most of the Gucci and most of the fluid waste. And then the heart fire is going to support, and the kidney yang is going to support, as well as the spleen chi. So early in the semester, we talked about spleen chi going into all the GI tract organs. That's still applicable here. No difference there. But the idea would be that the small intestine, as a hollow organ, needs to get its resources from someplace else. And in this case, its internal pair helps support it by the fire phase contributing yang. And then the kidney, because there has to be all of this fluid waste handled, that also contributes some yang. So the small intestine gets a lot of support in TLC from these other organs in kind of a classical mindset. Again, in our TCM classes, this is not going to be talked about very much, but it is like kind of a big thing when you get into sort of more the advanced studies, especially if you get interested in things kind of outside the standard TCM textbook stuff, which you probably will because most people do to some extent or another. The other big thing to say about the small intestine, and this is something that can happen with a lot of Zhang and Fu organs, is that the main pattern that's talked about in the TCM world is that if the heart has pathological heat, it will try to send this heat down and eliminate it through the small intestine. This is going to be something we're going to see overall. Zhang organs will sometimes try to dump their problems into their associated Fu organs with the idea that the Fu organ will somehow be able to eliminate it. So this is sort of a general principle in TCM, not something just limited to the small intestine. But the idea is that the small intestine pathway is kind of particular, and this is the main thing you learn in our TCM textbooks over and over again. Like this is the pattern they concentrate on. That this heat goes in the small intestine. The small intestine doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't have any direct route to the outside world. So the heat goes out with the fluid waste, and this eventually ends up into the bladder and it becomes a contributing factor to UTI. So again, I know this camera is suboptimal here. Hard to know where the good focus point is, but let's say it's somewhere around there. The point I'm trying to get here is that there's heart heat, that heart heat, uh, pathological heat gets dumped out through this internal external pair connection that goes into the small intestine. The small intestine tries to dump this stuff out of it. It doesn't really have any direct route to the outside world, so it pushes it out into the water phase, right? Through the kidney into the bladder, and then that becomes a contributing factor to things like recurrent or chronic UTI. Usually what happens then is that there's some kind of emotional upset that is the trigger for this pathway to start. Something happens that's upsetting, affects the heart and the Shen, and then the heat builds up. Remember early in the semester, we had talked about this lady whose husband had died suddenly and her tongue kind of split. That was a bad sound effect. Anyways, this terrible thing, this tragedy of the loss of her husband, and then, all this emotional pain, and then, the splitting of the tip of the tongue, uh, just really as a reflection of just how painful the event was. And this, what also happened in that case, there were panic attacks and palpitations, tachycardia, these kinds of physical heart symptoms. There was anxiety, other symptom of the Shen, and then that heat got vented out into the small intestine and then into the bladder, so she had recurrent UTI as well. So it really shows how this pathway can become an important part in cases like that, and usually tied back to like emotional upset. In that case, it was like obviously something like transcendently terrible, the loss of a spouse, shocking and suddenly. Sometimes it's more, I mean, on the relative scale of things, more minor upsets. But anyways, wherever this heat can build up in the heart, you can get some pattern like this happening. Okay, so that's what I got on that part of the small intestine. There's one other interesting thing to say about the small intestine here, which is also kind of psychologically based. And there's this little phrase, separates the clear from the turbid. So I want to include this phrase, and it always really should be included because it's sort of a special little phrase that's used in relationship to the small intestine. And the idea is that on the one hand, as a physical thing, this is probably already covered by these other two functions, right? Controls receiving and transforming, separates the fluids. That's separating the clear from the turbid. We kind of talked about that already. When this phrase is used in relation to the small intestine, sometimes what's happening though is it's being really brought out to talk about the psychological impacts or the psychological effects of the small intestine. So I have a little bit on psychology and the Fu organs here. In general, I think we know that from our five phase chart, those same emotions can affect the Zhang and the Fu. That can happen. But the Fu organs are kind of interesting because sometimes you get these little separate psychological observations about them. So the separating the clear from the turbid idea has to do with the psychological impacts of this. If the small intestine physically doesn't do a good job of this, and remember in TCM, there's always this notion that the body and mind kind of mutually affect one another, the Shen and the body. So if the small intestine can't do its physical work, it has a psychological impact too. And the idea will be that the person can't separate the clear from the turbid in their life. So this is, again, kind of an interesting part of TCM in that mind-body connection that can go either way, really, that the psychology of the small intestine is this problem of not being able to separate the clear from the turbid. So this is a person who can make decisions, but the decisions are very likely going to be like, from an outside observer's perspective, like not that good. And they won't make a lot of sense. And so the outside observer would say, okay, I know that you made that decision, but like if you really took a step back and then you could separate the clear from the turbid, you would kind of realize, well, this isn't really the right choice for you. And that's kind of the special psychology of this. So an outside observer would say, well, that's not really a good career choice for you, or like that doesn't really seem like the right partner, or that doesn't really seem like that's the right direction you should go in your life. You're losing the things that would be more valuable and you're keeping the turbid, something like that. I have a little story about this for what it's worth. I guess I'll on screen share for it just real quick. There's a patient I saw who had these kind of small intestine problems, and a lot of problems that you have to say were probably a little bit more like psychological. And as I thought about it, I began to realize like, oh yeah, she really does have this inability to tell like the clear from the turbid. Like she was a very shy person and she was always wanting to do career things where she'd have to be in front of people all the time. So there was one part of her that I guess was drawn to that, but it was kind of agonizing for her. And she was involved in dance, and she said before every performance, it was like not just like the anxiety before a performance, but like that a lot of people might have, and then you get over it. She had like panic attacks, and it was terrible for her, and she just didn't enjoy it. And we're thinking, this isn't right for you. And then she went on to other things, and they all involved some element of like performance in a way that was very unpleasant for her. And you could see similar things kind of in her personal life. You think, okay, well, maybe this is a good partner for her. And then as she would talk more about the person, you'd be like, oh, this is totally the wrong person. You can't really say anything about that on some level. It's the person's own decisions, it's their own life. But, it's one of those things you do observe as a TCM person, this inability to separate the clear and the turbid. So I got an anecdote. There's something kind of clinically interesting about the context for this. The great psychologist Alfred Adler. He was a protege of Sigmund Freud and was in that kind of group of people around Freud. And he had what was his first question for patients. So this is just kind of clinically interesting, someone who's interested in clinical stuff like we are. And he would ask this as his first question. And the question was, what's your first memory? Which is kind of a provocative question in that the first memory might be real or not real. Both of those things could be possible. They might be fictive memories. But in any case, it's interesting what the person says, is their first memory. So you can get, if you ask this to people, and I would occasionally do this in clinical practice, could still do it now. Actually, maybe I don't do it as much. Maybe I should do it more. But you can ask a person a question like this, and it's again, Adler thought this was very psychologically informative, and it kind of sort of is. So I know when I thought about it for myself, and we can each think about it in our own lives. For me, my first memory is that my dad was in this car crash when I was maybe about 2.5, 3 years old, something like that. I wasn't potty trained yet. So whenever that was. But I was really young. And I can remember my mom sitting at the bottom of the stairs, kind of being all in shock because, this terrible thing had happened. She had gotten this phone call, hung up the phone afterwards, because that's the same sound effect for tragic events that I'm using for this particular video. But anyways, this thing had happened and, she was just stunned and it wasn't obvious that my dad was going to make it. And in that little kid way, I could tell something was wrong, but you don't quite know what's wrong. So I kind of just walked down the flight of stairs, and I can see this very clearly through my own eyes. There was this idea if you see a memory like that and it's more like shot like a movie from your own perspective, then it's more likely to be real. So this feels very real, probably, not just something that someone told you later and you sort of see it shot like a movie from the outside and you're like a character in the movie. Anyways, I can see it through my own eyes. And I walked down the stairs and I kind of just did that little kid thing where you put your arms around the adult's shoulder or something. You're like, oh, something's wrong. And that's my first memory. So, a relatively serious one, obviously. I've often thought about the idea that I'm a very kind of metal phase person, and that's a very metal phase, sadness and grief driven event. And there are people who will argue that sometimes in the TCM world, if you get these very kind of major early life events, they impact you in the 5 phases in some way. There was sort of a sadness and grief that went through the family that was eventually relieved because my dad came home. But anyways, so if you ask this question to people, you'll get some very dramatic ones. I remember asking it to someone, and their first memory was kind of a wild background story for this person. Their parents had met in like they were both institutionalized. So they had met, as two people with like schizophrenia, and eventually, the patient's mom had been, uh, you know, uh, let out, I guess you would say, right? Had been kind of like released and was able to kind of live more on her own. I don't think that ever happened with her father, but she was staying with her mom in like a church hostel. And the patient woke up, little girl, and like the whole building had somehow caught on fire. So she was, waking up in kind of this blazing building and had to get rescued from this fire. And I was like, okay, well, that's a dramatic one, right? Sometimes it's not so dramatic. And I suppose in some ways these are less dramatic people. So I had a patient who said, my first memory was it was my birthday. We were supposed to have a party. It rained. So that was a bummer, but we had the party inside instead, and it was really good. And I was like, okay, that's a not very dramatic person. Or sometimes it's just things like I was taking a bath with my sibling, and then I just had a poop in the tub, and people were mad at me, but then it was okay. I've actually heard that story too. Anyways, first memories. For this patient I was talking about who couldn't separate the clear from the turbid, here's the story that might make this memorable. We'll see if it works for y'all. Relatively memorable. So I asked her, like, what's your first memory? Because I was trying to explore some of this more clear and turbid stuff. And she said she was walking down the street with her mom and her sister, and she looked down at the ground, and there was what she thought was like a Baby Ruth candy bar, like lying on the ground. So she scooped it up and she was going to pop it in her mouth. And then her mom and her sister went, wait, stop, because it wasn't a Baby Ruth candy bar at all. It was actually a turd. So she dropped the turd and everything ended up with a happy ending to the story. But I remember thinking as the punchline of the whole thing, like, oh my God, your first memory is not being able to tell the clear from the turbid, like from the very beginning. So, anyways, a little psychology, and hopefully it makes it a little bit memorable. All right, so that's the last of the things with the small intestine. A little bit longer for this one in the sense that there's some psychologically interesting stuff that happens with this. The psychology of the stomach gets to be more about kind of stomach heat and desire, the desire to ingest things and take things in, and that could psychologically be the desire to take in like experiences. Um, so if the stomach heat is very strong, then you might get people who get strong desires. If it gets really bad, they might get kind of chaotic. This is brought up with people who have like bipolar disorders. They'll get a lot of stomach heat, and that sometimes will lead the person to like acting out in ways that are like, okay, I'm going to try to like shovel all this experience into myself in this kind of uncontrolled, pathological, and chaotic way. So sort of the pathological joy, but also this pathological sort of like taking in of stuff, that kind of metaphor. And then the patient might act out financially or with substances or sexually because they're just like driven by this desire to, take in experiences, right? On the other hand, if the stomach is very weak and the spleen doesn't support it, then you might get the opposite effect. The person seems to like not engage in the world with a in a very dynamic or meaningful way. Mm. All right, so that's some of the psychology. Where am I at here? Oh yeah, small intestine. There's the yellow emperor that we already talked about. Heart and the small intestine we talked about already too. In some ways, the heart does support the small intestine. It kind of provides some resources for it. On the other hand, there's always this idea that the Zhang organ can dump pathology in the Fu organ, and that happens with the small intestine. On the other hand, you can see that the small intestine and the heart aren't talked about together here at all, like the way the spleen and the stomach are. And they're really in like separate jiaos even. They're not even anatomically close. So for the heart and the small intestine, and when we get to the large intestine and the lung, their relationships are acknowledged to be not close in the way that the spleen and the stomach and TCM theory or the kidney and the bladder or the liver and the gallbladder are. Okay, that gets us into the large intestine. Less is really said about the large intestine. It's a bit of a shorter one than the other ones we've been looking at. The language in the textbook, like Masiosa, is very confusing to me. I think large intestine and especially bladder are really confusing, but you get this idea controls passage and conduction. What does that really mean? It just means that at the end of the whole GI tract, the large intestine is going to be responsible for the very end of this and ultimately elimination through defecation. We can sort of see what the yellow emperor has to say about this. It says the large intestine is responsible for transit. That's transportation again. And part of the idea, whether you call it passage and conduction or transit, transportation, is that the same way the stomach starts the process and has an impact, what you might call upper Yangming, the stomach part of Yangming, the lowest part of the GI tract, the large intestine, which is also Yangming, has a kind of an impact on what's going to happen through the rest of the GI tract in this special way because if the stool can't leave, if defecation is impaired some way or another, again, constipation or diarrhea, really, this has a negative impact on the whole GI tract. It kind of disrupts transportation through the whole system. So that's kind of the secret thing behind controls passage and conduction, or is responsible for transit. Yeah, that's what they're really getting to. And then you get a little like yellow emperor poetic language here because it says the residue from transformation stems from it. That always makes me smile because the residue of transformation is almost like courtly language for feces, for shit. So the residue from transformation, you can tell that it was written in kind of a high Chinese poetic style or something. But anyways, that's kind of the idea of that. The last piece of this is really, or the other piece of this, last or other, is this idea of transformed stools and reabsorbs fluids. Okay, so this is really just talking about fluid content in the large intestine and how meaningful that is. So fluids need to be reabsorbed. And again, the large intestine takes waste fluids, kind of like the small intestine, but not as the main source, but it takes residual waste fluid, shunts it into the water phase, into the bladder. And then, there's your reabsorption of fluid. So the stools aren't too loose. Or on the other hand, if there's not enough fluids in the large intestine, the stool will be more dry and hard and then difficult to pass. So, that has an impact, and this whole thing is kind of talked about there. Large intestine and the lung. On the one hand, the lung depends on who you talk to, but there's definitely people in Masayoshi that does this. On the one hand, the lung will support the activity of the large intestine. That means some of the lung's qi can help support the large intestine qi. Not everybody makes as big a deal about this, but Masayosa does kind of interestingly, so I like to point it out. And there might be something where the fluids of the lung and the large intestine kind of impact each other a little bit too. On the other hand, there's always this idea that a Zhang organ can eliminate through the Fu organ. And this is very interesting because TCM does have conversations about this. And if you look kind of close clinically, you can see this. A typical thing will be something like a person has an upper respiratory tract problem, problems in the lung or the throat or the nose. And then it happens a lot with Chinese herbs actually for external invasions, for infectious disease things. The person will take an herbal formula and then they'll have like a kind of a purging of that pathogen almost through like the large intestine. So the person will have loose stools, and then weirdly enough, all these lung symptoms will all of a sudden be better. And it happens clinically. It's like a very clear thing to see when someone points it out to you. In the TCM world, that would be the lung shunting the pathogen out into the large intestine and that being eliminated. My daughter, who's now 23, but when she was a little girl, her body was amazing this way. She would get like the start of an external invasion, which would for her would be like the sniffles, kind of like some nasal symptoms, this kind of stuff. And there's some great things if you're around kids or if you're interested in pediatrics in terms of your practice. There's these great kind of techniques of what are called like Chinese pediatric Tui massage for kids. And it's just a very clever system where they do most of the massage. Kids are very sensitive to touch. So a lot of the massage is directed on the hands, the wrists, the arms. It's these very kind of mild, non-invasive kind of ingenious massage techniques for young kids, and a lot having to do with like helping kids process through little infectious disease things like this. And so for my daughter, on the first day when she get the runny nose and all that, I do my little pediatric Tui Na. Sometimes I give her some herbs, but even just with the pediatric Tui Na. And by the next day, all the nasal symptoms would be gone. And then she'd have like kind of this constipation with this dry, hard stool. It was very distinctive. And then you do a little bit of the massage just to kind of treat the constipation, the large intestine problem, move the stools. And, once that stool was passed, well, she was like fit as a fiddle and ready to go off and like continue to cause more mischief because she was a very like Sagittarian little girl, very fiery, and she'd be off on her way. And I think as we talked about in class, I haven't really taken an antibiotic personally since 1996. And my daughter almost, never needed them. My son either. We would just do these kinds of TCM things, which are really amazing. So if you have kids or you're around kids or peds are part of your practice, it's really amazing. And then also this particular dynamic of the lung and the large intestine is very interesting. Urinary bladder. So, oh, I didn't do this with the other organs. Xiao Chang, Xiao means lesser or minor or small. Chang is an intestine. Da Chang, larger, greater, major. Okay. Pangguan, that just really means bladder. And as far as I know it, and again, you don't need to know them, but there's the language, in the pinyin. So this is the urinary bladder. And again, I think even more so than the large intestine, this language is really abstract to me. So I think, and something like Maciosa, it just says removes water by chi transformation. That, to be honest, is like a TCM person that's so vague. I have a hard time knowing totally what that's about. So that language never really spoke to me. Yeah, I don't think that's very clear. So I think the easy way of talking about this is if you live your whole life and your bladder contains the way it's supposed to, so you don't have problems of like urinary incontinence or urgent frequent urination, you'd say, way to go, bladder. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for you for my life. And then if it properly does transportation so that urine can be eliminated. It doesn't become obstructed. You don't have problems like with urination in terms not of like the insecurity, but problems with elimination, the urination. The urine doesn't want to eliminate properly. The transportation part is impaired. If that doesn't happen, if this all works fine, then you'd say, thank you very much, bladder. I'm very grateful for you. And that's it. So essentially, the bladder has to do these two things. If you want to call that removes water by chi transformation, but that's essentially what this is about. And that really talks about the relationship between the kidney and the bladder in some ways. And I'll get more about that down below, but kind of entwined organs, obviously. Now, and that's it. So the Neijing is very interesting on this, though. You really don't get any reference to what we would think of as being the normal physiology of the bladder. You get this very kind of big picture, kind of poetic, symbolic almost sounding language. So here's what it says. It says the urinary bladder is responsible for regions and cities. It stores the body's fluids. The transportations of tree then give out their power. Well, okay. Could you give me a little bit more on that, Yellow Emperor? Okay. Couple of ways that this is talked about as a little bit of like Chinese historical trivia. Take one more little drink here. In the areas, excuse me, where Chinese medicine was being developed, good grief. Sorry, my throat's been a little funny today as I'm recording this. Um, the UB is responsible for regions and cities, all this kind of stuff. So in the area where uh, this whole system of medicine was being put together, one of the things they talk about a lot as a historical factor is there was a lot of problems with either flooding or distributing fluids properly, distributing the water supply properly. Because the rivers would flood, there's all this concern about pathological water, even, you know, in terms of the local geography. We talked about the I Ching earlier in the semester. And in the I Ching, there's lots of talk about the water in the I Ching as always being something dangerous. And you're like, well, okay, why are they making such a big deal about water? They don't talk much about fire being dangerous, but water is always talked about as this dangerous thing. And when you kind of look at this a little bit more historically, what some people will say is that's because they always had problems with like water distribution and flooding and these kinds of things happening. So water always has this connotation of being potentially dangerous. Where am I going with this? Well, when you talk about the damage caused by the water, the bladder has kind of a special role internally when you kind of push this inside the body. If the bladder isn't able to properly control the water supply in a way, now, of course, other organs are influencing this. We're talking about the bladder's role in this. If for some reason the bladder won't contain and fluids are lost, or for some reason the bladder especially backs up and fluids start to back up, well, this creates a whole ripple effect. And then all the regions and cities get flooded and the body fluids aren't doing what they're supposed to. And then you have problems with the whole system. The transformations of chi aren't going to be able to do their job right because everything is kind of flooded. So that's kind of a major point of concern. And it relates back to this part of it. It stores the body fluids. Again, that's kind of a funny language. No one thinks all the body fluids are stored in the body. What they're really talking about is how urinary output is a measure of what's going on in terms of fluid metabolism on a very basic level. So we've talked about this before with yin and yang. If you have yang being very weak and building up, well, you have all kinds of problems with fluid metabolism, and then the system's going to flood. That's one side. I wanted to say one other thing about this, though, because in part, this is always read to me as also a reference to the urinary bladder in terms of its channel. And one of the things you see when you're an acupuncture student, and it's very striking and probably counterintuitive or surprising, that the channels a lot of times do a lot of stuff that don't seem to have anything to do with the organ that they're connected to. And this is probably no more true, nowhere more true than when we talk about the urinary bladder, because you have this little bag and its job is to contain some urine and then hopefully eliminate it in the proper way. And then hallelujah, everything's great. And then you got this channel that has like 67 points on it, which definitely seems like overkill for like a little bag where that's its job. And quickly what you realize is, oh no, wait a minute, this channel has its kind of own identity. And one of the things about the urinary bladder channel to connect what we're doing here in with your classes that are more the acupuncture theory classes is the urinary bladder channel is this very long channel, right? And it connects to all these really important parts of the body. So it connects to the eyes, connects to the ears, connects into the brain, moves through the thoracic region, through the lumbar region, and and it has this way of connecting into all of those internal organs through what are called the back shu points. So these are the points that are kind of like the front mu points that we talked about before. These are points that connect into the internal organs, but this is from the posterior side. And they're on like certain vertebral levels, and it's one of those, again, TCM student rites of passage to memorize all these. Like UB13 connects into the lung at the level of T3, and then UB15 connects into the heart at the level of T5, and so on. So it's this main thing where this channel kind of ties together the whole system. These important things, eyes, ears, brain, all these internal organs are kind of tied together. So it's kind of a crazy channel. It does all of this kind of unusual stuff, and especially as it runs through the thoracics. So the idea is it has this special relationship to kind of like all the regions and cities are tied together. So if you read this as opposed to the bladder, if you read it in terms of the channel, then the UB is like a transport network connecting all the regions and cities together. And then, as that works out right, the channel and the organ, then that means that the transformations of chi can then give out their power. So that's the idea behind this. This is the kidney and the bladder kind of having this special relationship with one another. Um, One of the other things that's brought up here too, and I think again, Jeffrey Yuen, Master Yuen is kind of a good person for talking about this, is that the kidney stores the yuan qi, as we've talked about. And some people will point out that that yuan qi gets the flow through, one of its ways it gets the flow through the body is through the bladder channel. And so not only does the bladder channel connect all these different parts of the body together, but there's this special connection between the kidney and the bladder channel and the yuan qi, that the bladder channel becomes a distribution for this yuan qi. So the constitutional energies of the kidney can connect through to the rest of the body through this special channel. Anyways, there's some context for y'all. We're going to see some special stuff with the gallbladder channel a little bit here too. That's our next one. Gallbladder is called Dan, though again, you don't really have to memorize these pinyin words, but there it is. The first part is the obvious thing, this idea of stores and excretes bile. There's the physical aspect of this, which is, obviously from a Western medical point of view and very transparent. The liver and the gallbladder are tied together very closely, kind of like the kidney and the bladder are tied together very closely, like we were just talking about, not only in terms of with the kidney, the fluid part, but the channel part. And then the liver and gallbladder have this special relationship too, that's going to have multiple aspects to it. But on a very simple level, we know that the liver produces the bile moves into the gallbladder, and eventually, it can be then like kind of like discharged, we'd say in TCM into the small intestine. And so the liver has this thing of not only the production of the bile, but one of the things that can happen in the gallbladder is you want to make sure that you don't have chi stagnation in the gallbladder, because that can be damaging to the gallbladder in terms of inflaming the gallbladder, cholecystitis, or in terms of things like gallstone, cholelithiasis. So not only is the liver helping the gallbladder out in terms of like providing the bile, but it's also doing that liver job of regulating the chi, regulating the flow, regulating coursing and discharge, if you like that language. And so, these two organs are tied together in this very important way on this physical level. Gallbladder's obvious job: stores the bile, excretes the bile, discharges the bile, and then the liver has this special relationship of producing and regulating the flow. So there's the physical stuff. Pretty easy peasy. There's a psychological aspect that's talked about here, though, very specifically. Again, we can go through and talk about potential psychological things with all of these organs. I'll go back a second. I didn't do it for the large intestine. But again, the large intestine gets associated with like the ability to like let things go. Can you let stuff go? Kind of like the way you can eliminate the things that are turbid from the body. Can you let things go that need to be just let go of? An obvious metaphor there. So anyways, you can see these kinds of things. Bladder channel is a little bit more complicated. So that one I'll probably let go. But sometimes people talk about this like being able to direct one's passions towards like concrete goals. So people who are able to direct their energies, kind of like the transformations of chi giving out their power, you're able to go and take your energies and direct them in very concrete ways to specific goals, this ability of channeling the energies. Anyways, that's that part. But with the gallbladder, we get some very, very specific and very emphasized ideas. This other stuff is a bit more subtle with the urinary bladder and the large intestine. Sometimes people bring it up and sometimes they don't. But this idea of controlling decisiveness is talked about really all the time in TCM. So this ends up being a very important idea. When we look at the Yellow Emperor's conversation about this, Not a single thing mentioned about any bile or anything like that. All that gets talked about is the gallbladder and its psychological impacts. So it says this kind of very interesting poetical stuff. The gallbladder is responsible for what is just and exact. Determination and decision stem from it. By determination here, they really mean more the ability to make a decision. So there's going to be a whole idea if people have problems in the gallbladder, like the ability to just make a decision is hard. The person will be kind of paralyzed and indecisive. They won't be able to go through and make choices in their life. You know, sometimes they're major things, but it's also the kind of person that could just be like in the wine aisle at the store and be paralyzed by all the choices of wine. I've talked to patients who are like this. It's very interesting. You know, these kind of gallbladdery patients and like even decisions like that, they're just kind of paralyzed. So this determination, being able to make a decision and kind of, okay, I did it. That's a gallbladder thing. Determination, decision stem from it. This is sometimes talked about specifically between the gallbladder and the liver. They'll say the gallbladder is responsible more for the decision-making part, the ability to make a decision, and then the liver is involved in sort of executing and planning that decision. This can be tied back into our idea of the hun again, where we talked about, you know, I can make a decision, I can have a vision of where I want to go, I can start to move towards those objectives. Again, like the liver's like a general, like a military general is sometimes the metaphor for this too. The wood face having these qualities. So anyway, so that's the idea, very psychological. To tie this all together with decisiveness, we can see this can go in two directions. It can either be too weak and the person will be very indecisive. They won't be able to go through and make those decisions. And then they do talk about other symptoms that go along with this that you'll learn more about it later. But along with that indecisiveness, they talk a lot about anxiety and they talk a lot about fear. They talk a lot about timidity. And then if it gets even deeper, they'll sometimes talk about people who are living in this world of anxiety, shyness, timidity, inability to make decisions, uh, uh, fear and anxiety. And then finally, this idea that the person might even have like suicidal thoughts. You would never take a risk on this, but the classics are kind of interesting on this point that even though you're concerned about this person, they have anxiety, or maybe what I would read in the Western medical world is like depression. So some of the anxiety might look like a generalized anxiety disorder, or some of these anxious, fearful, and even, you know, suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideations, you might say, in the psych world, um, you know, kind of go to anxiety and depression things. But this may not be the person who would be most likely to take their own life. Not that we'd ever take a chance on that, but the observation is interesting because that's such an extreme decision. The person's kind of paralyzed on that point too. And you can, again, it's these are obviously stressful and tough patients, you know, because obviously, you know, you're really worried about patients like this, and we wouldn't take chances on this thing. Obviously, these are things that mental health would have to be involved. But you know, that observation is very interesting because I think you do see it in patients. You know, they'll have a lot of suicidal thoughts. They live with a lot of fear, anxiety, kind of inability to make decisions and know what to do with themselves. But then, you know, they may not be the person who most likely will act on it. I got one more thing here that I can do a little bit on this one, which is the role of gall, because we're talking about the gallbladder. One of the things that's really interesting about this to me, as kind of a closer, is that um, there's almost kind of a folk thing about this, like maybe around the world, this idea of the organs. Whoops, former student calling me. How funny. Um, I didn't put that on silent. Sorry about that. But this whole idea of gall. Okay. So, you know, almost again, as a kind of a folk thing around the world, you know, this idea of like how much gall do you have in the gallbladder and how does it affect your personality? Seems like it's like beyond just like TCM or beyond Chinese culture. I grew up in the same household with my grandma, and she was of that kind of generation where you could say of somebody, they have a lot of gall. And people don't say that too much anymore, but in English, if you did say that, what you would be meaning is that it'd be a person who would be the opposite of like lacking the gall that we were talking about. They'd be too decisive, too pushy, too stubborn. They wouldn't want to listen to other people. They're too aggressive. And you're like, well, that person has a lot of gall. Again, people used to talk that way, and what that really was rooted in was this idea of, how strong is your gallbladder, and that connection that Chinese medicine is making between the body and the psychology of a person. You can kind of see that in other cultures around the world, and we have that in English too. So you imagine that could happen in like Shakespeare plays, where we'd say, you know, uh, Richard III has a lot of gall, which he does, or whoever we're talking about. If you flip side it, to be or not to be, that is the question. I'm so full of doubt, Hamlet lacks gall or something. So this is a kind of a folky thing that, is kind of beyond, the Chinese medical world. And as you go through life, and sometimes it's public figures and sometimes it's people in your own life, you can kind of feel like, well, there might not be the right thing of being just an exact, because that's what the LMR is trying to say. You don't want to have too much gall, pushy, stubborn, opinionated, won't listen to others, too aggressive, those kinds of negative qualities of too much wood. On the other hand, of course, you don't want to have that kind of paralyzed, anxious, fearful thing that patients who have these more sort of deficient gallbladder things have as a problem. And again, probably related to things like generalized anxiety disorders and depressions and things like that. All right, just a little bit left, and then we'll wrap everything up with the triple warmer. The gallbladder channel and the gallbladder organ. The gallbladder channel, again, is very interesting. And for our class, we talk about this when we look at the extraordinary organs, because the gallbladder is not only a Fu organ, it's also an extraordinary organ. So the idea is that the gallbladder channel, a lot like the bladder channel, connects to a lot of important structures along its pathway that give this channel a lot more meaning than what you would have just from a little organ that stores some bile and spits it out occasionally. And if it's really bad, you can just take it out. The gallbladder channel has a lot more going on. And in a way, I think even if you lose the gallbladder in terms of an organ, the channel is still trying to do its job. Jeffrey Yuan, who we've mentioned, our Taoist TCM key opinion leader in the United States, says, well, you can survive without your gallbladder, but there is a reason to try to save it, because this organ and channel together as a system has a kind of importance to it beyond just the organ. Anyways, gallbladder channel connects to the eyes, connects to the ears again, a lot like we talked about with the bladder channel, connects into the brain again. As it goes down, it has a connection into, in subtle ways, the reproductive system, and non-subtle ways, the reproductive system, but it does connect into the breast tissue. It connects into the kidney at gallbladder 25. Sorry, my voice is being funny. Gallbladder 25, and then it connects into the external genitalia as well. So breast tissue and the external genitalia. As it continues downward, by the time you get to gallbladder 39, it also connects into the bone marrow. So if you look at the whole story of that, it has a lot of connections to like deeper structures in the body and things that we associate with the Jing. And again, we talked about that also when we look at our extraordinary vessel conversations. Liver and the gallbladder. So we looked at the liver's influence on the gallbladder. It provides the bile. It helps regulate what's happening in the gallbladder. So we looked at that side. The gallbladder has kind of an interesting relationship to the liver that mirrors some of the stuff we talked about with the lung and the large intestine and the heart and the small intestine. When there's a problem in the liver, especially the liver being vulnerable to, as we've been talking about the whole semester, chi stagnation and heat. So when that heat builds up in the liver, that can kind of get shunted into the Fu organ of the gallbladder. Now, sometimes that can create symptoms that are GI tract related, like the gallbladder will um, uh, kind of invade into, with the wood invading into the earth, or the wood invading into the stomach. Not only will you get chi stagnation and counterflow chi, but patients will throw up bile, right? The gallbladder is part of this process of venting out pathology from the wood phase. Or what also happens probably even more often in our patient population would be that the liver dumps heat into the gallbladder. The gallbladder doesn't have any place to do it. It goes into the gallbladder channel. And this is considered to be a major mechanism behind pathologies that develop in the gallbladder channel. So a classic example of that would be like lateral headaches, migraines, where there's a surging up of chi and heat into the gallbladder channel, and that affects the superior parts of the body. And if you look at the gallbladder channel, I think a lot of y'all have already learned it, you know, when you look at migraine sufferers, a lot of times the pain will start behind the eye where the gallbladder channel is and then surge back through the side of the head. Or it might start like as a stabbing pain at gallbladder 20 and then surge forward. There's a whole way in which this connects into the gallbladder channel. And then the whole idea would be, okay, there's something wrong in the wood phase. A lot of times these things are also triggered by stress. And then you get the problems in the liver and chi stagnation and heat, and it shunts into the gallbladder. And with no place to put it, sometimes the gallbladder will just dump that into the gallbladder channel. And that can get in like different aspects of the gallbladder channel. Superior, obviously, is one of the major things, but sometimes other spots along the gallbladder channel too that are more inferior. All right, one more organ and then we're done. Triple warmer is an easy one to talk about overall. And then there's just a little picture that you have to draw. I'll do the best I can with our little whiteboard with this to give you some sense of this. But the triple warmer or the sand jiao, as we already talked about, san means three or triple, jiao, who knows how to translate that? Warmer, burner, heater. You'll get different books that will do different things. Um, a lot of times, I think in English, you do need to know san jiao because people would just say that a lot. So that's kind of an exception. You really do need to know that particular little Chinese phrase. And sometimes people even put like SJ5 for an acupuncture point or something like that. So you get a lot of Sanjiao references. You know. Anyways, this Jiao word kind of hard to know how to translate it, but any of those words would probably capture some of the meaning. And we talked about dividing the body up into these sort of three regions. But anyways, from the point of view of what we're going to talk about here, we'll get more to the three regions a little bit down below when we kind of look at our little picture of the triple warmer model. But the basic idea is that the Sanjiao will, as they say, control the water passages and the excretion of fluids. That's the fluid model we were talking about. If the triple warmer flow through it is going the way it's supposed to, it's a hollow organ. Again, fluids will move through it in a nice way. Fluids won't get stuck, and then it allows the fluids to flow as they're supposed to, and then fluids can then be excreted the way they're supposed to. If fluids do block up in the triple warmer, sometimes that will impair urination, because the fluids will all be jammed someplace and they're not flowing through right. But anyways, the whole idea is that fluid should be flowing through in the way that they're supposed to. And that's part of the fluid model. Controls the transportation and penetration of qi. That's the idea that qi is also moving between these different parts of the body through the triple warmer. Like the gu qi is going up, or the yuan qi is going up, or qi is moving around the different parts of the torso in this way. And in a kind of a general, maybe a little bit vague way, but in a general way, the idea is that it's moving between the jiaos through the triple warmer. Again, not a lot of anatomy behind that exactly. There's not wires or tubes that the fluids and the chi are moving through, but the general idea is that as long as these jiaos are kind of connecting the way they're supposed to, things will be able to move through the torso in a smooth way and they won't get bunched up. But a lot of TCM pathologies, things don't move in a smooth way and they do get bunched up. So, anyways, one of the other parts of this is the transportation of yuan qi, meaning that not only is qi moving through in general, but specially speaking, yuan qi is moving. This again is the source qi connected to the kidney. And this gives us two major routes that we can look at here. In the TCM world, the emphasis is a little bit more on the yuan qi moving through the triple warmer. And we saw that like going up to the upper jiao to connect with the da qi and the gu qi. It moved from the kidney through the triple warmer up. That's an important idea, and everyone acknowledges that. The other part of this is that we mentioned before is that yuan qi also can move through the bladder channel. A little bit less of that in the TCM textbooks, but most people probably agree that that's true too, especially true in the classical world. The triple warmer channel. Okay, again, it's a shocker, but maybe we're used to being shocked. We have a channel that seems to do a bunch of stuff that doesn't really have to do with this organ. So we have another thing like that. The triple warmer channel tends to get used most often, really, much more so than dealing with like movement of fluids through the different parts of the torso. But it has a lot more to do with the treating of like external invasions and infectious disease stuff. So it's not the kind of thing as a TCM student you really see that coming that could feel counterintuitive. That's part of the reason why I like to mention these things because they are counterintuitive. You can sort of feel, a little bit taken aback, caught off guard. Like, why are they talking this way? Isn't this thing supposed to have to do with chi and fluids moving through? Why am I confused? You're not confused when you come to this part of the curriculum. Everybody sort of knows this, and I think it's nice just to acknowledge it up front so you can anticipate it. It's a funny conversation, in that it's something you really don't expect that channel to be involved with, but that's its major thing. The three burner model. Okay, last of these, this is kind of, I'll read the words and I'll draw a little picture. This is kind of talking about the three parts of the torso, these three jiaos. And the comparison is obviously to like an alchemical chamber, like you're doing some alchemy or some early chemistry, protochemistry. Or it's also probably fine to say that you're making some grain alcohol or some moonshine. So it really has this feeling of referencing the body as its own kind of little chemistry kit. Now we do that, of course, in modern thought too. The body is like a little chemistry kit. This is, like this is sort of an old school version of that idea. Again, not literally, but a way of talking about how the body can be sort of thought about in this kind of poetic way as being like this alchemical apparatus. So we got the three jiaos. The upper jiao is described as being like a mist. The middle jiao is like a maceration chamber. I have no idea what a maceration chamber was. I had to look that up. It's kind of the translation again that you get in these textbooks. Sounds a little ultimately medieval. It's kind of like a cauldron. Bubble, bubble, toil and trouble in our kind of Shakespearean conversation of the day. But this idea that you have a chamber that all the ingredients go into, and that's the idea that you're going to dump foodstuffs and fluids into this chamber. That's the middle jiao, and then finally in the lower jiao, the idea is the lower jiao. They say it's either like a sluice or like a little Bunsen burner. Sluice was another obscure word. I was like, what's a sluice again? But it has the idea of like a drainage ditch. So the lower jiao is a place where if you think of the body like its own little chemistry kit and you're processing things through, where do the waste products go? Well, they go out through the lower jiao. And that's true, right? So, urination and defecation are like the functions of the sluice part of the triple warmer, with things being eliminated in that way. The Bunsen burner part is really a reference to the idea of what we're calling Mingmen fire, or we're using that synonymous with kidney yang, this idea that there's a little fire in the lower jiao and it's under our maceration chamber. That's our pot where the ingredients are going in. And I'll draw a picture of this in a second. And so ingredients go into the pot, into the cauldron, the maceration chamber. Stuff drains out, the waste fluids and the waste products. But there's also the kidney yang, the constitutional fire of the lower jiao burning under this pot. And so it's kind of the last piece of the lower jiao, or the other piece of the lower jiao having, both of these qualities. And then the idea is that if you're making your grain alcohol or doing your alchemy or your protochemistry, then from the maceration chamber, the good ingredients would rise up to the upper jiao and you'd collect them up in your collection chamber. And so the upper jiao is a mist where the pure resources are rising. This is actually why you talk about the dachi, guqi, and yuanqi all collecting in the upper jiao. That's the idea of that like upper chamber of the chemistry kit or the alchemical kit, or you're making your moonshine, all that stuff collects in this upper chamber. So that whole thing of dachi, guqi, yuanqi, tetruchi always seemed very weird to me when I was a student. But when it clicks that what that really is a way of talking about this conversation, this idea of this triple warmer and how the good ingredients end up in the chamber in the upper part of your alchemy. That's the reference. If we were to draw this up, which I'll do really quick, and then we'll be done with our whole thing, go us. But the idea will be that the lower jiao is kind of like a Bunsen burner. Here's our little Bunsen burner down here, that little flame. It's also like a sluice where things are being eliminated. The middle part of this is kind of like a little pot where all the ingredients go in. And then the idea is that the guji goes up to the upper jiao. And then the upper jiao ends up being kind of like a mist. So when you draw this out, you end up with something that looks kind of like this. And I know our whiteboard is but with the way this camera focuses, but crap. But kind of like this. Well, it looks kind of bad. This camera is like not the best for this, but that's probably the best we're gonna get. So here's our lower jaw. This is supposed to be like a little flame. I don't know what that ends up looking like. Not a great picture. But anyways, that's the kidney yang, or what we're calling the Ming Men fire, the life gate fire. It's burning away. It has the pot sitting on top of it. Things are being drained out. Okay. Other things are rising up to the upper jaw. And, that's our Gucci that collects in the misty area of the upper jaw to combine with things like the Dachi and the Yuanqi. And that's the whole idea. So this is the alchemical framing, the protochemistry, the moonshine making way of thinking about the triple warmer. And you can see that it has an influence on how we talk about aspects of TCM for sure. All right. Well, that's about it, y'all. We did it. A short little lecture, on the Fu organs, started with the stomach and then with the triple warmer. That's all you need for this. Okay, take care, everybody, and we'll see you in class. Bye, everyone.